Did you know the Bible describes a mysterious group of beings who lived on earth before the flood, and apparently were remembered afterward? They were called the Nephilim. Some Bible translations describe them as giants. Ancient Jewish traditions connected them to rebellious heavenly beings, known as the Watchers. And centuries later, the Nephilim would become connected with some of the most mysterious stories in biblical history. But here's the problem. A lot of what people believe about the Nephilim today isn't actually stated in the Bible. So who, or what, were the Nephilim? Were they giants? Were they the children of fallen angels? Were they simply powerful ancient warriors? And if the flood destroyed the world of Noah, why does the Bible appear to mention the Nephilim again afterward? Today on Did You Know? Bible Edition, we're separating biblical text from later tradition as we investigate one of the greatest mysteries in Genesis. Who were the Nephilim? Before we begin, remember this important distinction. The Bible gives us surprisingly little information about the Nephilim. Later ancient writings, especially the Book of Enoch, greatly expand the story. So throughout this episode, we'll separate what the Bible actually says, what ancient traditions say, and what different interpretations suggest. Let's begin in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 says that as human beings multiplied across the earth, daughters were born to them. Then something unusual happens. Genesis chapter 6, verse 2 says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Immediately, we're confronted with our first mystery. Who were these sons of God? Then Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 introduces another mystery. The verse says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that." The King James Version uses the word giants, but the Hebrew text uses the word Nephilim, and this distinction matters. The Hebrew word Nephilim is difficult to translate with certainty. Although giants became a traditional translation, the word itself does not simply give us a clear physical description. Genesis continues by describing mighty men associated with this strange period, men of old, men of renown, and then, almost immediately, the biblical story turns toward humanity's wickedness and the coming flood. Genesis tells us that human corruption had become enormous. Violence filled the earth, and God determined that judgment was coming. That judgment would be the flood of Noah. But Genesis never stops to give us a complete explanation of the Nephilim. It never gives their exact height. It doesn't tell us their individual names, and it doesn't explicitly give us a detailed biography of their origin. This is where later interpretations become important. One of the oldest interpretations identifies the sons of God as heavenly beings. Under this interpretation, these beings took human women, and the unusual offspring connected with those unions were the Nephilim. This interpretation did not appear out of nowhere. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, language translated as sons of God can refer to members of the heavenly court. For example, the book of Job describes the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord. That is one reason many ancient interpreters understood Genesis chapter 6 as describing heavenly beings interacting with human women. And this is the interpretation dramatically expanded in the book of Enoch. If you watched our previous episode about the book of Enoch, you'll remember the Watchers. According to 1 Enoch, heavenly beings called Watchers descended to earth. They took human wives. Their unions produced gigantic offspring. Those giants became violent and destructive. They consumed enormous amounts of food. And according to the Enochic story, their violence eventually turned against humanity itself. The Watchers also taught humans knowledge the text portrays as forbidden or corrupting: weapons, warfare, sorcery, enchantments, astrological knowledge, and other heavenly secrets. Eventually, the earth became filled with violence. God judged the rebellious Watchers, and the giants were destroyed. But remember, that detailed story comes primarily from the book of Enoch, not from Genesis itself. Genesis gives us only a few mysterious verses. The book of Enoch builds an enormous narrative around them, and that distinction is extremely important when discussing what the Bible actually teaches. But the fallen angel interpretation isn't the only explanation. Another interpretation says the sons of God were actually descendants of Seth. Remember that Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. Under this interpretation, Seth's descendants represented a godly family line. the daughters of men, are sometimes interpreted as women from another human lineage. Their intermarriage supposedly contributed to humanity's moral corruption. This interpretation avoids the idea of angels reproducing with humans. But it also raises questions. Why would ordinary marriages between two groups of human beings result in the mysterious Nephilim? And why would Genesis use the unusual phrase sons of God, if it simply meant human descendants of Seth? Because of questions like these, the interpretation remains debated. There's also another major theory. Some scholars interpret the sons of God as powerful kings, rulers, or warrior elites. Ancient kings sometimes claim divine authority or divine ancestry. Under this interpretation, Genesis chapter 6 may be describing powerful rulers, taking women however they desired. The mighty men and men of renown would therefore represent legendary warriors or oppressive rulers, rather than supernatural hybrids. This interpretation places Genesis chapter 6 within the ancient world's traditions of kings, warriors, and claims of divine status. So already we have at least three major possibilities. The sons of God were heavenly beings. They were descendants of Seth. Or they were powerful human rulers. And Christians and scholars continue debating these interpretations today. But now we reach an even bigger mystery. If the Nephilim existed before Noah's flood, what happened to them? According to Genesis, the flood brought catastrophic judgment upon the world. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives survived aboard the ark. So naturally, you might assume the Nephilim disappeared. Except Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 contains 4 strange words. And also after that. And later in the Bible, the word Nephilim appears again. This time, we're in the book of Numbers. Israel has escaped Egypt. Moses sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan. The spies return with reports about the land and its inhabitants. Most of the spies are terrified. Numbers chapter 13 says they described seeing extraordinarily intimidating people. Then Numbers chapter 13, verse 33 says, And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. Again, the Hebrew text uses Nephilim. The spies claim they saw the Nephilim, and they say that compared with them, we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. This has created one of the biggest questions surrounding the Nephilim. If the Nephilim existed before the flood, how could they appear again generations later? There are several possibilities. One possibility is that Genesis chapter 6 itself already indicates the Nephilim existed in those days, and also afterward. Some interpreters therefore believe whatever circumstances produced them before the flood somehow occurred again later. But there's another important possibility. Numbers chapter 13 records the frightened spies' report, and those spies were trying to convince the Israelites that entering Canaan was impossible. They may have been using dramatic language to emphasize how terrifying their enemies appeared. The Bible records what the spies said. That does not necessarily mean every detail of their fearful report was intended as an objective scientific description. And notice what happens next. The people become terrified. They refuse to trust God, and Israel ultimately suffers because of their unbelief. But Numbers introduces another important group, the descendants of Anak, the Anakim. The Anakim were remembered as unusually formidable people. And they're not the only group in the Old Testament associated with extraordinary size or strength. The Bible also mentions groups called the Rephaim. In Deuteronomy, we encounter one particularly famous king, Og, king of Bashan. Deuteronomy describes Og as one of the remaining Rephaim and gives the extraordinary dimensions of his bed, or possibly sarcophagus, depending on interpretation. The dimensions are approximately 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Depending on the cubit being used, that's roughly 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. But here's another important distinction. The Bible describes the size of Og's bed, not necessarily Og's exact height. A large bed does not automatically prove its owner was exactly the same length. Still, the description clearly emphasizes Og's extraordinary stature or reputation. And then we come to the most famous giant-like warrior in the entire Bible, Goliath. When David encounters Goliath, the Philistine warrior is presented as physically intimidating and heavily armed. Most people immediately connect Goliath with a Nephilim, but technically, the Bible never calls Goliath a Nephilim. Goliath was from Gath, Other unusually large warriors were also associated with Gath, and biblical traditions connect several giant clans with regions Israel encountered in Canaan. So Goliath belongs to the Bible's broader tradition of unusually formidable warriors. But calling him a Nephilim goes beyond what the text explicitly says. This is where internet discussions often combine several different biblical groups into one category: Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, and giant warriors such as Goliath. These groups are related in some biblical traditions and descriptions, but they are not simply interchangeable names everywhere they appear. And there's another popular claim we need to examine. You may have heard that the Nephilim were demons. That idea largely comes from later ancient Jewish tradition. The Book of Enoch gives a fascinating explanation. According to its story, when the giant offspring of the Watchers died, their physical bodies were destroyed, but their spirits remained upon the earth. Those spirits became evil spirits that afflicted humanity. This tradition became influential in discussions about the origin of demons. But once again, Genesis does not say this. The Bible does not explicitly say the spirits of dead Nephilim became demons. That explanation comes from Enochic tradition. It's fascinating historically, but we shouldn't confuse later tradition with explicit biblical teaching. So what can we actually say with confidence? The Bible explicitly mentions the Nephilim in connection with Genesis chapter 6, and again in the frightening report of the spies in Numbers chapter 13. Genesis associates their appearance with the mysterious sons of God, the daughters of men, and mighty men of ancient renown. But Genesis does not explain their identity in detail. Ancient Jewish tradition, especially the Book of Enoch, interpreted the sons of God as rebellious heavenly beings and developed the Nephilim into gigantic offspring of those unions. Other interpreters understand the passage differently, and that is why the Nephilim remain one of the Bible's greatest mysteries. But perhaps the most important part of Genesis chapter 6 isn't the Nephilim themselves. Look at what happens immediately afterward. The biblical writer moves away from mysterious beings and focuses on something much more important: human wickedness. Genesis says humanity's thoughts had become continually evil. The earth was corrupt. The earth was filled with violence. And God saw what humanity had become. In other words, the Nephilim may capture our imagination. The Watchers may fascinate us. The giants may make incredible stories. But Genesis is ultimately leading us toward the story of Noah, judgment, and salvation through the ark. The central message isn't simply, there were giants. The central message is that creation had become corrupted by violence and rebellion, and judgment was coming, but God preserved Noah. So, did you know? The Bible really does mention beings called the Nephilim, but it gives us far less information about them than many people realize. Genesis places them in the mysterious world before Noah's flood. Numbers records Israelite spies claiming to have encountered them again in Canaan. Ancient Jewish tradition connected them with fallen heavenly watchers. Some Bible translations call them giants. Other interpretations see powerful warriors, rulers, or legendary ancient figures. And thousands of years later, we're still debating exactly who they were. But now that we know what the Bible actually says about the Nephilim, there's another mystery waiting for us. Because Genesis doesn't only mention the Nephilim, it mentions the beings connected to the entire mystery. The sons of God. Were they really fallen angels? Who were the Watchers? And does the Bible describe angels rebelling against God before the flood? That's where we're going next. If you enjoyed this episode, comment below. Who do you believe the Nephilim were? Were they giants born from rebellious heavenly beings? Powerful human warriors? Ancient kings? Or something else entirely? And follow Black AI Bible for more biblical history, mysterious passages, ancient texts, and fascinating facts on Did You Know? Bible Edition.